Well, thank you everyone for joining us both online and here in person. I do know that many people braved the weather to be here, and we're very appreciative of this. It is a very timely and hopefully interesting event for all who are joining. We're talking about obviously 1 year after the Camp David Summit last year between the United States, South Korea, and Japan. And so to start us off, I'll give us a bit of introduction. I'll then introduce our speakers. We'll hear from each of our experts before opening the floor for questions. I will say that we'll take questions both online and in person, so if you have questions, please think of them. And for our online colleagues joining us, do make sure to send those in. And we'll be checking our phones to make sure we receive those. So 12 months ago, the three leaders from the United States, South Korea, and Japan met for an unprecedented historical summit at Camp David. The summit was historical in the fact that it was the first time the three leaders gathered for the purpose of specifically highlighting the trilateral partnership. Out of the 2023 summit came the spirit of Camp David, as well as the principles of Camp David, both detailing the shared values and resolve held by the three nations to pursue policies that are in closer alignment. At the time, onlookers both celebrated this accomplishment while also questioning the long-term staying power in the US-ROK-Japan Trilateral Partnership. Now, as we think through 1 year later, the three nations have accomplished much on their to-do list, from expanding new cooperative spaces for trilateral discussions in trade, emerging technology, and environmental sciences, to establishing platforms for real-time missile information sharing and trilateral military exercises in the Indo-Pacific region. However, ongoing geopolitical events from the war in Ukraine to the overarching strategic competition between the United States, China, as well as the Russia and North Korea Mutual Defense Pact all serve as stark reminders of the importance of close cooperation between the United States and its key allies, Japan and Korea. Moving forward, the three countries will most likely need to continue to chart this pathway forward to address opportunities and challenges amid intensifying regional and international security dynamics. So today, we'll definitely delve into the past year overall, as well as talk a little bit through what has been accomplished, what remains to be done, and discuss what maybe lies ahead for our three countries. Now, I'm very excited and delighted to be joined by actually three experts. Our third expert will be joining us, so we'll be hearing from her as well. But for today, I'll go ahead and do a brief introduction for everyone. I think people have their bios in front of them as well as on the website. So I'll do a quick run through of introductions before I turn the mic over to both of them. So Dr. Seung-Yeon Lee is a 2023 to 2024 fellow here at the Wilson Center and a former Kim Koo Korea Foundation professor of Korean Studies at the Tufts University. He is an expert in his own right of North Korea and all things Korean politics, and his book, The Sister, has reached global fame. I think many in this room recognize that title and have hopefully also read it and are looking forward to the potential future of also the movie as well, so the documentary. So I think we're very excited for it. We also have Dr. Dina Barnes, who is associate professor in the College of International Security Affairs at the National Defense University, where she specializes in 20th century history and international relations with a special focus on the US and East Asia. Additionally, we will have also joining us Dr. Ha-Yeon-Ryu Ellison, and she is an assistant professor in the College of International Study Affairs as well at the National Defense University. Previously, she was a non-resident fellow at the Korea Institute for Marine Strategy, and I'm very excited to have both of them join in particular because I think this is the first time we've had an NDU colleague coming over this side, so I know we've gone over there, so this is very nice indeed. Now, with that all being said, I do want to have our speakers speak, and we want to hear from each of them. So what I've asked is each talk for about 6 to 8 minutes. What is your assessment? What are your key takeaways? We'll pull out some questions from there before we turn to general questions from the audience as well. So, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Kayla, and thank you for braving the weather and spending your precious time here at the center today. If I drone on, please nudge me. Please give me the signal. I see the Camp David Trilateral Summit meeting of last year in part as a significant step forward in chipping away at the big taboo in South Korea, which is even in a contingency, even in a war in the Korean Peninsula, we stand opposed to Japanese boots on the ground. That is this strong feeling which the majority of the South Korean population espouses, that we stand very much adamantly against even humanitarian missions conducted by Japanese self-defense forces in and around the Korean Peninsula. This is a reality, it's a taboo, it's sometimes puzzling to Americans especially because it's a matter of profound pragmatism. Japan is the only democracy ally, quasi-ally, the only advanced democracy in the region. We know that Northeast Asia is a very rough neighborhood. You have China armed with nukes, Russia armed with nukes, North Korea armed with nukes. Japan is a natural friend and perhaps even an ally to South Korea. Yet, due to the complexities of history and the prevalent view throughout South Korea, that Japan has not nearly been as forthcoming in terms of its war crimes than, say, Germany, because that is a reality. It is a complex issue. But I think the Camp David Trilateral Summit is an understated and an indirect, but the first step forward in starting to chip away at this taboo. In September 1950, in the wake of the North Korean invasion and the start of the Korean War, some 3 months into it, of the 260 ships that sailed from Yokohama Bay to make their way to the Korean Peninsula to provide logistics and so forth for the Incheon landing operation of September 15th. Of the 260 vessels, 37 were manned by Japanese troops. There were almost 4,000 Japanese crew in that contingent. And this is a function of necessity. It was very controversial at the time, and of course, neither side, that is the US or Japan, admitted to Japanese participation, thousands of former sailors of the Imperial Japanese Army in combat operations in Korea, along the coast, in North Korean waters as well, minesweeping operations, first minesweeping operations. The Chinese and the Russians found out, of course, and they complained. They issued, along with the North Koreans, various complaints in newspapers and articles, warned of World War III. And in mid-August, the New York Times very astutely published an editorial criticizing this maneuver by the US and with the consent of the Japanese. The New York Times editorial argued that this is illegal, arguably, because Japan's sovereignty had not been restored yet. Japan was not a member of the United Nations, and for Japanese troops to be operating under US auspices in combat operations was illegal. That is, Japan was being played or was playing the role of mercenaries. Number two, of course, Koreans, South Koreans stood opposed to this. Very much the antipathy for Japan was quite strong, of course, at the time. And number three, this might lead to World War III. The Soviets and the Chinese might escalate due to the US provocation, as the Times argued. My point here is that in another contingency, Japan is a natural friend. And out of necessity, out of the extremis of war or humanitarian disaster relief operations, the Japanese will play a role in transportation of relief goods, or perhaps the infirmed, or POWs, or the dead combatants. Japan is there to play a constructive role, and we have to start thinking more about that alternative future and try to shed ourselves of this taboo, this notion that no way, Japanese troops are not welcome in South Korea or in the Korean Peninsula. There is, of course, the real matter of prevalent anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea. There is no better way to boost your ratings if you are the South Korean leader than to fan the flames of anti-Japanese sentiment. Quickly, let me just give you one example. In 2005, on the occasion of the centennial, the 100th anniversary of Japan's incorporation of Tokdo, or Takeshima, as its own territory, Japan's Shimane Prefecture declared that February 22nd will henceforth be known as Takeshima Day. A week or two later, the then South Korean President, Roh Moo-hyun, announced to his nation, "We are on the verge of a serious war with Japan." And his approval ratings within a course of 5 days, went from 20 to 48, almost a 30-point spike. And President Roh even said a few days later that henceforth South Korea will play the role of the balancer in the region, pursue an equidistant foreign policy vis-à-vis Washington and Beijing. The point here that I'm struggling to make is the residual hostility, perhaps that's too strong a word, anti-Japanese sentiment, let's say strong ambivalence about Japan's role in the future of the Korean Peninsula. This is a reality. We can't just lecture to South Koreans and say, espouse pragmatism, just accept it. It is a thing. It is a real factor that weighs on the trilateral friendship among Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think thinking things through a little bit, this is an interesting conversation point, obviously, for a lot of our Korean colleagues because of the context of the history, and I know we'll hear a little bit of the history context in present day as well. One thing I do want to highlight from what you said is you said chip away, and I think that's an interesting phrasing when thinking about just what can be leveraged and how fast movement can actually happen and when are people accepting of that concept. So it's the little by little. I'm sure we'll get into more conversation on the topic as we move into Q&A. So Dana, without further ado.
All right. Hello, everybody in real life and online. It's a pleasure to be here and to be an NDU representative here in person. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And as an NDU person, I'll go ahead and say the necessary disclaimer, which is that my views are entirely my own and do not necessarily, in fact, likely do not reflect the views of the United States government. So there you have it. Right? So when we were asked to prepare a short opening statement for today, the prompt was essentially, what are the biggest successes and challenges that have come out of the first year of this new trilateral partnership? And when I thought to successes, my mind went immediately to the same place that Dr. Lee did, which is thinking about the improvement in the relationship between Japan and South Korea, two countries which, as you've just heard and you likely have considered already, are neighbors with shared interests that have had real difficulty engaging in serious cooperation despite entwined economies, despite similar political outlooks, and despite a long history that both of them share of bilateral relationships with the United States. It's been very interesting that two countries with so much in common and with shared security concerns vis-a-vis North Korea, that they haven't been able to work together closely in the past because largely of history questions, which I'm the historian here, happy to chat about, and they certainly are salient and poignant. So one of the big successes of this trilateral agreement in its first year is that it's happened at all, and that it's been marked by increasing dialogue and engagement between the countries of Japan and South Korea across levels. So we've just heard this example of boots on the ground, and that is absolutely visceral and real example of this kind of increasing relationship. But you also have a range of summits, meetings, dialogues, and discussions across a range of leadership and ordinary folks, especially within the military realm from both countries. So from the highest level presidents and prime ministers down to the lower level folks who are working on the security exercises that happen in the area. And so this kind of a robust, sustained interaction is a dramatic success from this dialogue and one, this partnership, and one that wouldn't have seemed possible only a few years ago. It really reminds us how much the world has changed and how much the security outlook has gone through a revolution, largely in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that, to me, was the biggest success. And the other is the attempt to institutionalize and make robust this partnership in the face of some of the challenges that I'll then talk to next, since challenges was the next part of my question. And so from having a memorandum of cooperation, but also setting timetables for when the next meetings will be, this has been really helpful in setting a sense of normal, expected, if you want, sort of mundane dialogue between partners. And that's invaluable for building lasting relationships, as well as personal partnerships that can weather things like the political winds that sometimes get fanned with nationalism for political purposes or other such things. And so these personal relationships that these repeated meetings are fostering at all levels is, I think, creating a more robust and stable dynamic between Japan and South Korea, which can be only good for security in Northeast Asia. So what have the challenges been? And when I thought about that, I thought first about the challenges that haven't been really within the control of any of the three parties involved. Things like the fact that the war in Ukraine grinds on, and the relationship and partnership that's grown between Russia and North Korea, largely as a result of that, and Russian dependence or use of North Korea for military hardware and supplies. This goes hand in hand with a more bellicose sound and tone coming out of North Korea. And that really does pose a problem for the partnership as a major security threat that this partnership needs to face going forward. Also a thing that brings it together. Yeah. Another big thing that has come up that didn't appear in the blurb for this event is events in the Middle East, right? And the crises in the Middle East have had a real effect on this bilateral partnership. From the perspective of the United States, it undermines a pivot to Asia by drawing attention and resources away from the region and towards a flashpoint crisis, and in some quarters leads to a reevaluation. Are we right to be focusing on the Pacific as the primary area of activity, or is it still the Middle East where the U.S. will invest the bulk of its resources for diplomacy and security? It's also the case that Japan and the U.S. have taken different positions in the course of that crisis. Japan has released statements against Israeli settlers in the West Bank, calling them to account for their violence against Palestinians, have frozen the assets of Israeli nationals, as well as more recently refusing to invite Israel's ambassador to commemorative events around Hiroshima and Nagasaki this year. And in response, the American and British ambassadors are not attending those events either. This is not Japan's primary security concern, but it does show daylight in the interests of these allies. And so it is something that we will watch going forward. More problems, some divergent interests, and these aren't new. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, if one looks at a map, North Korea is the primary security concern for South Korea. This is and remains an existential threat, even more so now that both sides have moved away from discussion of reunification. But for Japan, it is also deeply concerned with security vis-a-vis North Korea, but it is also, along with the United States, primarily focused on China. And so that division can play out in terms of priorities and messaging. It is a much wider regional vision from the perspective of Japan and the United States. And you hear that in the approach that Japan and the US are taking by the volume of jargon. So many different terms to talk about the same thing. The US and Japan interested in building a lattice work or a multi-layered framework or a web of security cooperation, looking for a range of multilateral alliances and partnerships as a way of counterbalancing China. And so that approach is, I think, a little bit different than the approach of South Korea and shows the divergent actions that Japan in particular is taking. And I think I'm about over time, but if I can, I'll talk just a little bit about the domestic situation. Is that all right? Yeah. I'll skip the U.S. I assume you guys are all familiar with the elections politics in the U.S., as well as some of American recruitment and funding issues to do with its military. And I'll leave the question of Korea and public sentiment towards this partnership to my other colleagues. And I'll just say a few words about Japan. First, Japan is going to have an election in September for leadership of the LDP, and this means it's functionally an election which will determine the future prime minister of Japan for the next 3 years. There is not yet a challenger to Kishida, but it's one of those who's going to go first announcing their candidacy. And so we'll see how robust the fight is or is not between potential candidates. However, I wouldn't say that that's going to dramatically reorient Japan's security focus and its vision of Russian actions and of violations of the international order, attempts to change the status quo through force as being the primary security threat for the region, which should be countered by alliance partnerships. I think all of the major players within the LDP have come to that conclusion. And it's one that is now shared more generally across the public if opinion polling and newspaper surveys can be believed. So the next big thing I think of when I think about Japan and its challenges for the future of partnerships like this, first, spreading itself thin, certainly by looking at many different partnerships. And second, the question of resources. More than the U.S., the self-defense force has a real problem recruiting the kinds of manpower it wants. It not only doesn't hit its recruitment targets, it doesn't come close. About 35–40% of the targets of what it's trying to hit. Now, there are plans to overcome that by focusing on high-tech solutions that require less manpower. Not there yet, and really are we going to be able to replace troops in a situation where you have an aging population, many more employment options. It's a problem for Japan and for its bigger aspirations of regional security leadership. And then the problem of funding, right? You all, I imagine, are aware that Japan has decided to dramatically increase its defense spending as part of an annual budget. And that is true, and we're seeing that happen. But the question is, where's the money going to come from? There's public support for this spending, which is the shocking change that comes as a result of Russia's invasion. But where the money is supposed to come from, the public doesn't agree. The public opposes increasing taxes, like the public's everywhere, I suppose. And the Bank of Japan's movement towards raising interest rates is going to make deficit spending more expensive for the government at a time where there's already been real downward pressure on the yen. And so we'll see going forward how much these sort of domestic problems play into the ability of all three of these countries to really engage in the partnerships.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. I do want to keep us a little bit on time, but I do appreciate, in a couple of points you made, I think it was very spot on to talk about the Middle East element into this, and so bringing that part of the conversation in. And I think it really stresses the point that U.S. attention, as well as our allies' attention, it's a premium, right? So there's a finite amount of agenda time and space, and recognizing how it's complicating the conversation, even within the alliance, is an excellent point. I also want to highlight that you talked about personal relationships. I think, especially in this space, we often talk top-down, so we think of presidential leaders, we think of things such as the summit tree, but also thinking about the connections with the military space as well, the leadership that's there, also thinking about the ministry engagement, the department level engagement, and what types of partnerships and potentially maybe more long-lasting cooperation and relationships that are there is also, I think, an excellent point additionally. We talk a little bit too much about the very, very senior level, and we should talk about the working level as well. So I do want to make sure we have time, and I'm very delighted that we have another NDU colleague who's joining us, and so I'll turn it over to you. Please do turn on the mic. Once it turns green, then our audience members online will be able to hear you as well.
So what's the questions you asked for Dr. Lee or?
Yeah, so far we've been able to cover, so we talked a little bit more Korea and Japan stance, so thinking about boots on the ground in Korea. We've talked also, as you just heard, a little bit more from the Japan perspective. And so we're still doing opening remarks. We haven't switched into any Q&A, the big questions, but we'll sure, if we have time, we'll jump into that as well.
So Dr. Lee has mentioned about the success challenges that Korea has or that trilateral relations has so far, or?
No, mostly focused on historical events like Japanese participation in combat operations during the Korean War in 1950 and how such a contingency might be necessary in the future or
Thank
not.
you. Thank you for, sorry for being like this way. So my focus is about talk about like a bit of challenges and then more about China's perspective. Of course, my view does not representing DoD or NDU or United States government. It's just my personal opinion. Challenges is that, as I think Dr. Lee mentioned about it probably, that historical issues and the territorial dispute between Korea and Japan. And then that's major issues because even though South Korean national poll right now is they conduct in 2024 August, the recent poll says that Koreans think that 56% of Koreans think that favorably about Japan. But they also feel like 80% of them still feel like Japan owe apology. So they want to have a good relationship with Japan, but they also feel like they need something more from Japan in terms of history. So there are diverse view about it. And then that's the challenges for current government as well as succeeding government. And then that's the big issue. And then also the other issues current president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, and then Japan's Prime Minister Kishida Fumio. They both have a suffering domestically, they have a little support in terms of they don't really enjoy popular support. Their popularity goes down, and then President Yoon's case is around 20s to maximum 38, 39 for last several years, but now it's 29. And Japan does also 20s too. So that means that the popularity of these two current administration really there and really not strong. And then what if that administration changes in the future? That whether these Korea and Japan's their link will be still sustainable. So that's the big challenges. Because I'll talk about more about China's angle and then mention this part again. But since Japan and South Korea both are U.S. allies, in that sense that U.S. and Korea and U.S.-Japan's relations are very strong. It has been a long history. It's a very resilient alliance relationship. But the problem is that weaker link here is, of course, Japan and South Korea, because they are not allies, but they are quasi-allies, and then in terms of they being linked to United States as being allies. So since they are the weakest link, and then this is actually pushed by current administration, that it gives us a lot of question about whether it's sustainable continuously. Because alliances are very resilient. It's an institutionalized one, but this kind of agreement or MOU is not as strong as allies itself. So that's the big challenges. And then from China's perspective, I'd like to point out is that China's main focus of this agreement, this trilateral relationship which goes to United States, they most directly critical about United States, but less about Japan and South Korea. They think they indirectly criticizing them, but their direct criticism goes to United States because they view United States the one initiating this, want to sustain this one, want to manage this one. So U.S. is the main director of this whole play. And then Japan is a kind of main actors, but not like the United States. And South Korea is probably more assistant level. So from China's perspective, what is behind the trilateral relationship is completely United States, and U.S. should be blamed for creating new Cold War situation in this stable Indo-Pacific area, especially Northeast Asia. So that's the main one. And then what China think about Korea and Japan is to some degree is that both, they think U.S. always wanted to have this trilateral relationship, but both partners, Japan and South Korea, they don't really respond the way United States wanted to. But somehow these two administrations, current administration with Korea and Japan, they somehow responded positively. They met right friend at the right timing. So they think if this friend stay there continuously, that's great, but what if they changes? So their approach is more wait and see, but direct criticism goes to US, but not so much about Korea and Japan. They think Korea and Japan's relationship is pretty still volatile and then not really steady enough. And they pointed out territorial issues and historical baggages and then burdens cannot be easily go away. So they will continue over the relation over and over again, and that they don't know when the government changes. So that's their primary view. And then what they really worrying about is Japan's military expansion. They don't worry about South Korea that much. They want us to see South Korea, how we're doing. But in Japan's case, they think even though the link is weak between South Korea and Japan, what Japan could get from this whole relationship is an amicable relationship for Japan's military expansion from China's perspective is that Japan could utilize this opportunity to making a stronger country in terms of military. So that's what they're worrying about. So it's something not really strong enough, but this could give Japan really a good way to expand it and then strengthen its military and then also have a good atmosphere in everywhere in terms of like military modernization, because South Korea has been opposed the Japan militarization to some extent, and China does too. So in that sense, Japan might utilize this opportunity. And then, as I say again, since China think that major criticism should go to United States, what they think about United States that So they think about the most beneficiary from this relationship, United States, of course. That's why United States is pushing forward. So South Korea, Japan probably not gain too much, but United States is a major beneficiary, majorly benefited by the whole trilateral relationship. So they think this is a big U.S. strategy trying to contain China and pressuring China, and then United States is using this to allies for their benefit. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think it's been interesting listening to each of our speakers kind of go through some of their points. And what I did appreciate is that the domestic politics came up, right? So we were talking a lot about what's happening on the ground in these countries, as well as what's happening at the high political level. And I think we'll come back to that kernel a bit later. Before I turn everything over for questions, and once again, I'll reiterate for those joining us online, please do submit your questions, and we'll be able to see them here as well. But I would like to pull us back to the North Korea question. I think, obviously, this is a big question. Each of you touched on it in some way. And I really want to dig in on the conversation about particularly more recent news for North Korea and Russia, and how does or doesn't change some of the calculus. You know, it has been a year since Camp David. We've seen tremendous movement, particularly in the military cooperation space, especially in security, but there's been, as mentioned, other movement in the trade and other spaces additionally. But how does this, particularly in the security dynamic, affect some of the calculus of the different countries? And I know that, Dr. Lee, you do speak often on North Korea, so I might start off with you if there's any additional comments you'd like to add to that.
Thank you. There was a lot of pontification debate on whether the paper agreement that Putin and Kim signed in Pyongyang on June 19th is actually a treaty, an automatic intervention treaty. Well, there are some precedents. In the July 6th, 1961 treaty signed by Kim Il-sung and Khrushchev, Article 2 states, if either party faces an armed attack or invasion by another state or a coalition of states, the other party will, without delay, provide armed military assistance and other support, end quote. Virtually the same verbiage, the same passage appears 5 days later in the treaty signed by Kim Il-sung and Zhou Enlai in Beijing on July 11th. And the June 19th this year treaty by Putin and Kim is basically the same verbiage. So yes, it is a treaty. But the more interesting, to me at least, point that I'm trying to make is every treaty can be said to be just a paper agreement until it is enforced. And of course, autocrats have greater leeway in being scornful, even brazenly violating treaties that they have signed. I can't think of a single international agreement that North Korea has signed, which North Korea has not brazenly, completely violated both the letter and the spirit of the international agreement. So whether Putin intervenes in case of a war in the Korean Peninsula remains to be seen, and whether Kim Jong-un sends troops, North Korean soldiers, to participate in combat operations in Russia or Ukraine, Russian-controlled Ukraine, remains to be seen. Although North Korea, of course, has ample supply of missiles and artillery shells, but it also has seemingly an endless supply of eminently expendable human lives. 500,000 people die, North Koreans die in combat, in war, far away in Ukraine, no big deal. 1 million people die, no big deal. So that is an advantage that both Putin and Kim enjoy, that dictators enjoy, vis-a-vis leaders that come and go via elections every few years. The two men, it seemed to me that Putin and Kim seem to relish brazenly rewriting international law and international norms, sticking it to democracies all over the world. They both took turns driving the Russian-made luxury bulletproof car that Putin had given Kim as a gift earlier in the year in February. Neither speaks the other's language, of course, so the poor interpreters had a very arduous task being alert. But during that short, brief sojourn by Putin, his second visit to North Korea since 2000, the two men seemed to brazenly project to the United States and the world at large that we are one, we are standing firm together against you, and we are rewriting international norms, international law, the way we deem fit. And that is a concerning development, a long-term concern for Washington.
Thank you. Would we like to add anything here before I turn to questions? Any additional thoughts from the panelists, particularly on the question of Russia and North Korea for now? But if not, then I'll turn it over.
I might engage in a brazen bit of speculation well out of my lane to say, within the context of the trilateral agreement that we're looking at here, and because it is a real and grave security threat to South Korea in particular, and because South Korea is the actor with the most risk of later pulling out of an agreement like this in terms of domestic popular opinion, this increasing threat increases the likelihood that South Korea would want to stay in such an alliance, even if popular opinion might be volatile.
Thank you. I think that's actually a good point as well, and it's getting us thinking. Very brave. I appreciate it. So we're looking forward. It's helpful. So okay, we do have a couple of questions I think slowly coming in online. I will turn it over to our distinguished experts and scholars in the room. If there are any questions for our panelists, any thoughts to add into this interesting discussion. Yes. We do have a Q&A mic, so please wait for our colleagues with the Q&A mics. This way we're able to hear online as well.
Thank you very much. My name is Jim Schoaf. I'm at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Thank you very much for this event today. I wanted to ask a little bit about the connection between, or the potential connection between, the minilateral movement, developments, the Quad, AUKUS. I mean, you still have the G7, of course, which has kind of been rejuvenated with Russia's invasion and the immersion of all these new technologies, and how are we going to deal with AI governance and this and that. So these minilateral organizations are kind of taking off. Korea is a notable outlier on these, and I wonder to what extent getting Korea involved in these minilateral pieces will actually help solidify the trilateral piece, and to what extent, Japan would be willing to give up its limelight and kind of, I'm the only Asian member of some of these international clubs. So flexibility on the Japan side, and trying to, what is the potential opportunity or obstacles maybe in a strategy of that kind?
Excellent, thank you for that. We'll take one more in-room question. I see Andy here.
Thank you. Andy Hong from Korea Economic Institute. Thank you again for your excellent presentations today. Actually, kind of related to the previous question, I was wondering if you could also speak towards, obviously we've mentioned the current war in Ukraine and the growing interest, especially in European circles, about South Korea and Japan, and of course, in addition to New Zealand and Australia, we get a lot of interactions between NATO and IP4. I was wondering, in the wake of the Camp David Summit and increased cooperation in the trilateral space with Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, if there have been changes in how that interaction has grown. And I think that's somewhat similar to the previous question as well, so I think we can kind of rope that all in together. I'm looking forward to your answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think we'll start with that, talking more the mini-laterals and where there's pull and where there's area to build upon. And maybe then we can think also a little bit in the context of Korea's GPS policy, so global pivotal state, and how that also ties into some of the big vision coming out of the leadership right now. So who would like to start us off on answering the questions? Dana, I saw you nod your head, so I may point to you to have you start us off, and then I'll pull back up to the other panelists. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking to myself, I should certainly leave this question out to the Korea experts to my right and left, which is what I was thinking as I was nodding. But I'll contribute that the magic of the mini-laterals is that there are many, many of them, and so certainly there's space if South Korea wanted to cooperate on a great number of them without necessarily Japan giving up its sole place. I know the Quad in particular is near and dear to Japan's heart, and being one of those four pillars along with Australia, India, and the United States, that would be a sort of challenge to Japan's self-image, perhaps. But there are many other opportunities for more engagement before you reach the threshold where that would have to be grappled with.
Excellent, thank you. You did nod very convincingly, so I thought you were ready to go. Yeah, so I'll turn it over. So actually, Hyun, would you like to go next? Yes.
So the first question, South Korea think that Japan really, that's really excellent point that is saying that Japan is actually in a part of a big, Japan's I have to say that Japan's foreign policy has really aligned with the United States in terms of Indo-Pacific strategy, but Korea's has not been like that way. It just changed 2022, December, when President Yoon decided to embracing Indo-Pacific strategy as a part of the foreign policy agenda. So in that sense, Japan, we know that Koreans think that Japan embracing idea like Quad in the early phase. And they, as you all remember, that 2007, it's India and Japan, they come up with the Indo-Pacific idea first. And then later, it's the United States president embrace the idea, and then it become Indo-Pacific strategy. And it was so major initiator for Indo-Pacific is actually from Japan and India. So in that sense, Japan was ready to embrace it from the big early phase. But while South Korea didn't think that way, but it become 15 extra years to come up with, decide to side with the Indo-Pacific strategy compared to Japan. So Japan is as an early front runner, as you know, as a member of a Quad, and then also this trilateral relationship is, as I think that Japan will, Japan is very interested in this, strengthening this relationship, but South Korea is not. This trilateral relationship is the only one South Korea actually embraces in this whole region. And then South Korea's, if you look at the South Koreans' Indo-Pacific strategy, what different from Japan is Japan's Indo-Pacific strategy goes beyond all the way to India and up to the even a little bit of like Africa. But South Koreans do not share the same view. What I'm trying to say is global South. South Korea has not embraced the idea of a global South, while Japan already think about all the way to global South. So in that sense, Japan is much more advanced in terms of, I'm not saying advanced, the much more early front runner to embracing Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, I I think that South Korea wanted to see whether this trilateral relations will work, because 80% of South Koreans at this current poll, recent poll, think that we have to continue strengthening this trilateral relations with U.S. and Japan. 80% of the population that say that, even though there are 80% people also say that history matters, and then we still need to settle down this issue with Japan, and that's 80% of people think that, but at the same time, that 80% of people see that we need to cooperate U.S. and Japan, and we should strengthen our relationship in that regard. So if this is popular support is really continuous, I think that even succeeding administration probably need to consider the fact as well. And then trilateral relations, all three of them trying to make it institutionalize it. So trying to lock them in. So that's what we need to wait and see. And about that, so okay, I'll just stop here and just give Dr. Lee mention about it.
Excellent. Dr. Lee.
There has been a streak of solipsism in South Korea's foreign policy. Again, South Korea is surrounded by overwhelming military powers. The Yoon administration is an aberration, I think. All of previous administrations, the South Korean president has at one time fanned the flames of anti-Japanese sentiment for political gain. Lee Myung-bak, you'll remember, became the first South Korean president to visit Dokdo, as he did, riding on a helicopter, landing at the island in August 2012. His successor, Park Geun-hye, on her first summit meeting with President Xi Jinping in June 2013, asked President Xi to build a statue of An Jung-gun, the Korean patriot who assassinated Ito Hirobumi in Harbin in 1909. President Xi went several steps further and built a monument honoring this anti-Japanese resistance fighter, whereas President Yoon, to date, has remained steadfast, taking a hit in the polls, of course, by reaching out to Japan and beyond, trying to play a bigger role in the world, in world affairs. So I think that deserves some recognition. Whereas his detractors say that the Yoon administration's hardline so-called stance against North Korea is bringing us to the brink of war. Well, there are so many precedents, so many examples of North Korea's fake peace outreach. I'll just recite quickly 5 or 6. On the eve of the invasion in June 1950, Kim Il-sung reached out to South Korea on June 7th and proposed forming an inter-Korean parliament, a joint North-South parliament. He did it again on June 19th, and then 6 days later launched the massive invasion. Did he have a change of heart? I don't think so. In more recent history, in 2010, in an effort to bolster Kim Jong-un's non-existing military credentials, North Korea proposed to South Korea on March 3rd, 2010, military-to-military talks, and then a few weeks later, on March 26th, torpedoed the Cheonan, the South Korean Navy vessel, killing 46 South Korean sailors. Later in the year, in October 30th, North Korea assented to having a separated families meet. It's a greet and goodbye forever kind of deal, but such a meeting took place in October 30th. And then a few days later, on November 10th, North Korea proposed to the South discussions, meetings on Mount Kumgang, reopening the tourism site. And then 13 days later, on November 23rd, shelled an inhabited island, Yeonpyeong Island. So North Korea is very good, not only at propaganda and bellicosity, but also fake peace outreach. So whatever North Korea does, it has a plan, it seems, more so than the other team. It is more proactive in engaging and also in insulting and attacking bigger patriot states, even like the former Soviet Union and China. So my point here is, for now, I think the current South Korean president administration is on the right course.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have, yes, I see two questions in the room, so we're going to go up here first for a question here, and then I might package one of our online questions into the discussion as we go as well.
Thank you. Thank you all three, and Kayla for great remarks and a great event today. First, I think Russia and North Korea, it is fear, weakness, desperation, and envy that are driving them together. They are afraid of alliances, they are weak, they're desperate, and they also envy alliances. So that's why I think they're driving together. Dr. Lee, you mentioned Japan and contingencies. I think one contingency you didn't mention, or maybe I missed it, is the possibility of internal instability leading to regime collapse. A huge role for everyone involved. I'd love to hear your assessment of internal instability in North Korea, because I think that's a real threat that we have to be considered about. That we have to consider. And along those lines, one thing that only Dr. Barnes mentioned in passing, both countries, North and South, have gone away from talking about peaceful unification. But the Camp David Summit, as well as the Yoon-Biden Summit in April, all support a free, unified Korea that's at peace. And Korea, of course, is really planning for unification more than it ever has in the past. This administration's Ministry of Unification is really focused on planning for unification, which I totally commend. But we in America have a disease that we're infected with. It's U.S. unification dismissiveness. We don't talk about it. And no one has talked about it from Camp David. So I'd be interested to hear your comments about why no one talks about unification, because I believe unification, solving the Korea question from the paragraph 60 of the armistice, the unnatural division of the peninsula, is the only way we see denuclearization and an end to the crimes against humanity that are being committed in the North. And so why don't we talk about unification? And should we? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we had another question on this side as well. There we go. Yes. Yeah, well. They should be on, yes.
Okay. William Chu, I have a question. I really appreciate the discussion about sort of Korean public opinion, and this relates to sort of the issue about PRC. I understand Dr. Joe Ellison's view that China sort of sees this South Korea, Japan rapprochement as unnatural and let time play it out. But that said, after the trilateral, they've also been doing things to try to wedge themselves into sort of the broader trilateral discussion. One over sort of the protestations over Fukushima sort of treated water release back in literally right after the trilateral. Those were coincidental. And then also, I think with the recent, was it the May China, South Korea, Japan trilateral, where they sort of hammered out agreement and a joint communique. So I guess the point is that China is interested in sort of undermining the trilateral in its own ways. And that leads to the question of, I guess, gray zone operations in terms of population influencing. Certainly what they did in Fukushima, they specifically targeted the South Korean media and sort of the population. What is sort of the South Korean government's viewpoint on these propaganda, media, gray zone operations that China is likely to continue to push ahead, at least until 2027?
Excellent, thank you. Actually, that divides quite nicely between our three colleagues in some ways. So I'll have us maybe start. So the question first is, why aren't we discussing unification more? And the follow-up question is in what ways are we seeing China taking certain steps and actions of interest to be in this space, especially post Camp David? I also want to add, one of our online questions is a bit broader, but thinking more about, in the past couple of months, how we have seen another push in the military space to establish trilateral exercises. Of course, we've seen trilateral exercises since last year in different spaces, but now there's an official named exercise. And thinking a little bit forward to, will this also help continue things onward past potential domestic changes and other political changes that were mentioned earlier today? So I'll add that as a third question, and maybe that ties into our already thoughts on this. So who would like to start us off? And I think at this point, just for the sake of time, I think this will be the last set of questions. And then, of course, we'll have time for those who are here in person to discuss over the buffet. So.
May I then
Please.
address the unification question? Well, admittedly, it is vexing. It is virtually impossible to guarantee or to assess when and how unification will take place in the Korean Peninsula. It's a difficult question. And historically, none of the actors, excluding North Korea, has been really interested in unification, has supported Korean unification until recent times, until the North Korean nuclear threat has become palpable. The fall, the demise of states, both big empires and small, is a recurring theme in history. The reunification of the Korean Peninsula is within the realm of the possible, although nobody can predict when it will happen. But if it happens, and the premise here for that sanguine prognostication is that North Korean society is controlled artificially by totalitarian oppression in extremis, it is extremely bizarre and arguably unprecedented, the most advanced totalitarian government control of the population that we have seen. And if there is a situation in North Korea, then the Japanese self-defense forces will have a monumental role to play in providing aid, disaster relief, all kinds of operations, humanitarian operations, as the Japanese troops did in the Korean Peninsula between August and December 1950, transporting POWs, fallen soldiers, and so on, as Japan would again in the Vietnam War, transporting by sea personnel and so on. Japan is a natural candidate for playing such a constructive role. And to close, I think that kind of fundamental change in the status quo in the Korean Peninsula, one for the better, I would think, would be a trigger for really ameliorating Korea-Japan historical issues. Japan will have a pressing stake in forging good relations with a united and free Korea. Japan will be a natural supporter and investor, and only then can the two nations perhaps put the past behind them and chart a course that is more constructive and more cordial.
Thank you. I'll also say, because this is the last round, so the same way that Dr. Lee did, if you have any closing thoughts you want to add in, I think we'll just go down the line and close out from there.
I'll just say, what an optimistic statement. I am delighted to hear it, and let's see what happens. And then to do with the question about multi-domain exercises and do they lead to the stability of a trilateral arrangement between the US, South Korea, and Japan, I certainly argue that they do. And largely, I think, less because of the question of interoperability and tactical reasons as much as from the human connection, both the building up of these relationships and also the ability of officials and really a wide range of people to create a common narrative, where at present you have quite a bifurcated narrative. And so that I see as really one of the examples of not a top-down, but a much wider kind of engagement that is perhaps helpful for the relationship in the future. And yeah, it's been a pleasure.
Thanks for the excellent question. So simply say, I'd like to say that South Korea is divided politically. So South Korea is like a completely divided, not just major or minor, it's completely just divided. It's polarized internally. So we call it, as the Koreans call, 일찍 or 원찍 or 일찍 or 이찍, which means that 일찍 or 이찍 means that 일 means one, two means two, which means, oops, I'm sorry, excuse me. So which means that one voted, I mean, I vote for number one candidate, I vote for second candidate. So they kind of derogate each person, the person who voting for what they oppose. So they, instead of calling, oh, you vote for one candidate, but they say you 일찍, means that you are voting for that one, I'm opposing that one. So South Korea is completely polarized in a sense. And then China knows it very well. China knows it very well. So even China's professor mentioned this one. It's not the trilateral relationship has to be supported by entire country, not by one regime, which means not by one administration. Do they have a confidence in themselves in a sense? Because they know Korea is polarized internally. If the next president is from other different party, they can make this whole changes. That's what China think about it. So I think in terms of that China will try and think about like Korea and Japan in a very different angle. They're trying to probably go to the bilateral, not just engaging at the three as a whole. They do some symbolic way, but I think more likely to go bilaterally. Japan's weakness and Korean's weaknesses or something completely different way. But Korean's case, they know Korea is polarized, and then Korea has a long history of polarization from Joseon Dynasty. So we call it Bungdang 정치, which means that the division is completely divided by two sections, and then we do make politics. So, but of course, the current Korean government does not, Republic of Korea does not need to think about like all the way like a historical background and then go to that way. But as I say, current and then sometimes we polarize ourselves because our security threat is directly come from North Korea. So there are people who trying to embracing and then trying to do something about North Korea, how to make a unification, versus we are facing whole four countries like Japan and Korea, Russia, and United States as allies. And then the Koreans feel like we have so many things to do at one plate. So there are division of like how to deal with United States. Here meaning is the ally, how to manage alliances, how to manage the historic issue in Japan, how to deal with a major country like China, how we can unify in the middle of all these major powers around them. So in that sense, their division is happen, and the major division is actually pro-US and pro-China. Here, pro-China means pro-North Korea, I like to say. There's nobody we call it pro-China. There is, but it's more about pro-North Korean approach people who do embracing we have to unify North Korea and embracing them more and more. They are more linked to and think of China more favorably. So pro-China, pro-North Korea approach, like a sunshine policy, the people backing that idea is actually supporting the pro-China too. So that's the kind of allies that China could find as somebody they can work with inside of Korea. So if it's China thinking about find a way to making this link be weaker, they're probably the target that instead of like, they can target whole country, but they know Korea is divided. One section, pro-North Korea people are the people they can work with, while the other one is represented by current president Yoon Suk-yeol is the other one. So they probably work with the other one, that one. It's already exist.
Thank you so much, and it's an excellent question. I think it's a very interesting one that I'm sure we'll continue talking about as we transition out. I just want to say a big thank you to our speakers. So far, we've gone through the past and context. We've talked about quite a lot of the historical context here and some of the lingering issues that are there and what might happen moving forward. We've also presented some of the successes and challenges. I think we very quickly moved into the challenges, which I'm sure a lot of people listening in are quite interested in because that is where the focus needs to lie. And we've also engaged in a little bit of future-leaning speculation. And so I think you all did a fantastic job of rising to the mission of talking about all of those points in one one-hour session. So I want to say thank you, and I think we'll close out the event here, but certainly continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.